The Faraway Paladin is a story about a young man given a second chance in a distant world, where he will rise as the Faraway Paladin. Yes, I know what I described sounds exactly like the plot of any Isekai story, but in actuality, this one is a fantasy story through and through. The Faraway Paladin has elements that bring it closer to a Western high fantasy story like, say, Lord of the Rings, as opposed to a Japanese Isekai light novel. The closest example I can think of in Japanese light novels is probably Goblin Slayer, which is heavily inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, with both being much more realistic fantasy stories as opposed to the game isekais, which is all the rage in Japan currently. You know, the ones with stats, OP main characters, a huge skill window. What separates the two, however, is that Goblin Slayer had each volume essentially being a separate D&D module, therefore an entirely separate adventure, with the main character being a experienced but relatively normal adventurer. Faraway Paladin, on the other hand, is a single continuous campaign that follows the life of a budding hero known as William G. Merryblood. I suppose the comparison to Lord of the Rings is probably overdoing it a bit, since I mean, yeah, it's a Japanese light novel, so it's still very different, but it does have more in common with high fantasy as opposed to most other light novels. As you can probably tell by the thumbnail, I'm going to be focusing on talking about the light novel version of Saihate no Paladin, otherwise known in the English adaptation as the Faraway Paladin. With that said, everything I talk about in terms of the story and characters will still be relevant towards the other adaptations, although I will highlight a bit of what makes the LN version more unique. There is an original web novel version published on Tsuyosetsu, but my rule of thumb is that if there is a light novel version, I'll try to read that instead, since the light novel version actually has editors and quality checking, leading to a more polished story as a whole. The light novel also has an official English translation, so everyone can read it no problem, which is probably a much better reason. If light novels aren't your cup of tea, there is a manga adaptation and even an anime one that is still currently airing, I believe, but I do recommend the light novel version of The Faraway Paladin. I'll be using screenshots from the fan translation of the manga version and bits from the anime as well, so you'll get a good idea of how every single one is gonna look like. To set things up, let's run through an incredibly bare-bones basic explanation of the setting for The Faraway Paladin. I'll keep things light since I don't want to get into any real spoilers. The main character is some Japanese dude who died and was then reborn as a baby called William, who is picked up by three undead creatures, Mary, Gus, and Blood. The city he's picked up in is completely empty save for the three sentient undead, who take it upon themselves to raise him and prepare him for the future. In both the anime and manga, you get the vague idea that Will's previous life had a problem where he messed up, lived a listless life, and wasted away, and eventually died. The light novel version, however, goes into a bit more detail to really hammer home his main trauma. We learned that in his previous life, Will had something traumatic happen to him as an adult and ended up a social recluse. He spent all of his days in his room in front of a monitor. His tolerant family didn't really scold him, but instead just coddled him, which, while a form of kindness, really ended up leaving him unable to muster the will to do anything. Eventually they died, and soon after he passed away as well, in some indistinct manner, regretting the entirety of his life. However, by some divine intervention, he was granted a second chance in the form of William in a world completely different from his previous one. Unlike his first life, Will hopes to lead a life that he can truly be proud of. What separates the Faraway Paladin from the other isekais on the market is that it's truly a fantasy story. It's not a game fantasy, as if the protagonist got dumped into Dragon Quest and finds a way to break the game system as fast as possible, but rather a classic coming-of-age story. Magic in this world isn't as simple as imagining what a fireball looks like, but instead it's something to be fantastical and revered. It has its own systems with drawbacks and consequences, and it feels like there is weight to every spell. Combat similarly feels gritty. In terms of combat scenes in light novels, it's one of the more interestingly written ones out there, where the spectacle is less about watching how many cool skills the main characters and villains can bust out, but rather how Will applies abilities which he has trained for all his life. His methodical fighting style might not necessarily be that flashy, but that in of itself is what makes it interesting. One of the most unique aspects of the Faraway Paladin light novel that isn't carried over to the other adaptations is the art style of the illustrations. The illustrations for the light novel are done by Kususaga Rin, and they are drawn with this faded watercolor sort of style. It isn't hard lines or classic animes that we normally see, but rather every illustration is almost like a painting. This sort of art style really helps sell the Faraway Paladin as a fantasy and gives the entire story an ephemeral sort of vibe. I'm going to show the exact same Gus scene from all three mediums to illustrate my point. First is the anime version where Gus is just floating there. He kind of looks exactly the same as he always does, even though he's supposed to be incredibly menacing for this scene, and even his glare is fairly weak. There's this fog that's supposed to make him scarier, but it doesn't really add much, to be frank. Now, for the manga version, instead we have Gus appearing from the back all of a sudden. Much more of a menacing aura. The inability to view his eyes adds to it for sure. Not bad. Now finally, let's move over to the light novel version and dang, just look at it. Unlike in the other two, Gus here isn't just some nice old man. Here he truly looks like an evil spirit. The way one eye glows from a completely obscured face, the monocle shining, the gnarled hands that look completely misshapen, the way the tattered cloak is draped over him, even to the wispy bottom half, which truly looks like it's fading in and out of nothingness. While all three adaptations try to show the same thing, I think the light novel version does the best job of evoking a sense of fear to the reader as they look at it, of depicting Gus as an antagonistic spirit, as opposed to a cranky old man without a bottom half. The light novel as a whole has this faded watercolor painting style, which really adds to the whole fantasy feel of the story, from the covers to the scenes inside the book. A lot is left to the imagination for the reader to fill in themselves, and honestly as a whole it makes it really stand out from the other light novels that are out there. It's, in a sense, actually pretty similar to Overlord cover illustrations, although the Faraway Paladin has even more of a ephemeral feel. There aren't really many illustrations in every volume, each one has like 10, including the cover, but they go a long way in setting up the feel of the story and how we view each character. Even the very first illustration of Mary, Gus, and Blood when Will is a baby is great in setting the tone, with each parental figure looking fairly monstrous. A strength of the Faraway Paladin as a whole is, as I mentioned before, a focus on the more realistic side of a fantasy story. Realistic might not be the best word, rather I suppose a better way of saying it would be more fantasy-like. Realistic implies the protagonist being basic swordsman A, when Will is still someone who is raised by 3 undead hero, is insanely strong, knows magic, is a holy user. It's basically a multi-class Munchkin character, but what I do like about the Faraway Paladin is that I don't feel like I'm watching one guy speedrun his way to brokenness. The whole idea of Isekai protagonists using modern knowledge to become super godly is great from a power fantasy perspective, but I think the way Faraway Paladin applies the setting is a lot more realistic. Even if you have a vague understanding of everything from a modern high school education, actually applying anything is probably not going to happen. Having a vague recollection of high school chemistry shouldn't really be that helpful. Like, yes, atoms and a periodic table exist, but would that really apply to making your magic insanely stronger? The Faraway Paladin pretty much goes down this route where William is a smart lad, and that's about it. His ability comes from the fact that he was taught by 3 distinctly different heroes with different strengths, and that through his determination to lead a better second life, he sticks with his training all the way through. When each adventure of Will's ends, it's not a happily ever after, but also having to deal with the aftermath, such as transporting goods, cleaning up the surrounding areas. Time actually passes in between each adventure from months to even years as an indication of that. Perhaps the greatest way that Faraway Paladin creates a more gritty fantasy feel is through world building. Faraway Paladin does a great job of towing the line between giving enough details to flesh out the setting and portray an overall feel of what kind of story this is, while at the same time not over-explaining and revealing a ton of obvious next area flag locations, so that there's still a sense of mystery to the overall story. Sounds a bit convoluted, so let me use some examples to illustrate my point. From the very beginning, we get the creation mythos, where there are good gods and evil gods. Ragnarok basically happened, where the gods of both sides, along with their forces, duked it out, reducing both of their powers to a fraction of what it currently is. Fairly classic stuff. However, while how everything came to be is explained through myth, how mortals currently function in the world is left fairly vague. Will's parents last interacted with the outside world about 300 years ago, and things have changed since then. Even with that in mind, the author still could have gone to deep depths in going over every single race, location, capital for 300 years back, but instead they decided to keep everything under a shroud of mystery. The world is an unknown factor that we, the reader, discover at the same time as Will does. This also gives a great sense of wonderment for the reader on what William will interact with next in the story. There is no obvious beast city, elf city, demon city that William will eventually reach. From a more practical standpoint, it also lets the author pretty much jump into whatever they want in future volumes. I even like how the gods themselves are established in the story, where gods aren't this nebulous concept that exists in the background, nor are they literally just chill people for the MC to hang out with. In this world, the gods, both good and evil, aren't able to manifest themselves into the world after the cataclysmic battle they had. However, they are able to reveal a portion of their power with people's prayers, and when a hero or villain commits an act, they can manifest a portion of their power if the gods have deemed them worthy. With the right circumstances, gods can even bring a lesser part of themselves into the world with enough power, which you see at the end of episode 3 with Stagnant, and at the end of volume 1. The fact that these gods don't just constantly throw mind chats at people during prayer, but instead appear spontaneously and incredibly rarely, gives them a much bigger sense of majesty. Sure, we see William indirectly communicate with Gracefield and Stagnant because those two are incredibly interested in him, but even in those communications, Gracefield is not portrayed as the main character's best buddy, but as his patron deity. The other good gods such as Blaze, Mater, we see flashes of their power and all, but never the gods themselves. In general, the world building is done fantastically. Even though the side characters don't get too much time focused on them, what little you do get to see of them is done well. Probably my favorite in this regard is Bishop Bagley. At first, just by looking at him, you assume he's the generic fat evil priest abusing his position. He talks pompously, gives everyone a sneer, dresses in rich garments, and even seems to phone in his sermons, but the author doesn't just write the head bishop as an easy figure for the main character to beat up and make himself look better, but rather all of this is a front in order to play the bad guy for the church, to push the demands necessary in order to protect the priests, and to counterbalance the much nicer and good-looking vice bishop. For the church to function, it can't just be a complete bastion of goodness, but rather has its own set of political dealings as well. It's a great spin on a tired old punching bag, and makes head Bishop Bagley much more interesting, even if we don't get to see him that often. Certainly, I will say the majority of the characters in the story are plainly good people, but they're also nuanced in their own little ways. Speaking of which, let's finally talk about William, the protagonist, and the titular Faraway Paladin. I already mentioned several things about him up until this point. His extensive training, his great skill in divine, magical, and physical abilities, and his main source of regret, which he has carried over from his death in his previous life. Will's many things really. He's kind-hearted, he's pragmatic, but it's the last point I mentioned earlier that I want to focus on. William G. Merryblood manages to pull off having a hero with imperfections rather well. In most light novels, it's easy to fall into one of three things. Either your main character is godlike in every aspect, they have a fault in their personality but use a punchline for a joke more than anything, or they have a fault but it's in essence a strawman fault, where they say they have it in order to look edgier, but it's not really given any real consequences in the story. In Faraway Paladin, however, William has one main weakness which is used to give him a sense of conflict. Inherited from his previous life, William knows that even though he's strong physically after all his training now, he's still as weak-willed as he ever was. When the going gets tough, he knows he can easily be led to crumple, and he knows that the minute he does it once, it'll happen over and over again. It's a conflict that Will faces time and time again. It's a triumphant feeling watching him fight against this mental battle over and over, especially because the conflict he faces is something that nearly everyone can relate to. Having the courage to take the first step to start doing something and then to not give up on it is really hard and really common. Therefore, it resonates really easily with the reader. He's pretty overpowered, but he still faces battles both mentally and physically that are above what he can handle. His conflict with Menelodor is better realized in the light novel than in the manga or anime. In the light novel, there's a lot more build-up regarding his thoughts and how he views the world. Much more time is dedicated to how he sees each situation, but more importantly, how biased of a view that he sees. How William tries to imagine himself as weaker, how he constantly puts himself down and prop others up. At first, it seems like just humility, a tempering his own hubris, but his reason for doing so really ties back to his most basic of fears. Will constantly does this throughout the entirety of the story, which is why when the conflict finally happens near the end of Volume 2, it feels like something that was built up until that point. The resolution is a little fast, but at the same time, it's only a part of the continuous battle that Will has with himself. The Faraway Paladin is a great fantasy novel. Nowadays, the game Isekai is a much more popular concept, the one where the main character falls into a manga, game, or book they've experienced, complete with stat windows, systems, all that good stuff. So to see a story which is far more rooted in high fantasy is a great surprise. Not just that, it also has a fantastic world building that establishes the fantasy world to be something pretty special. There's a sense of wonderment that some other stories don't do quite as well. Probably the only thing I have to caution is that the web novel and light novel hasn't been updated since 4 years ago, so there's a good chance that Volume 4 is probably the last one we'll ever see. Although who knows, maybe with the anime adaptation, the author's interest in the story might be rekindled, or maybe something else has happened. There are currently 3 different mediums to experience this story in: anime, manga, and light novel, and I do recommend the light novel version overall, thanks to its more nuanced description of William and his thoughts. Having to imagine what the words in the book are trying to convey really gives more of a sense of mystery to everything. With that said, if you prefer to read mangas or watch anime, both options are out there. If you enjoy what you saw, all the supportive stuff, like, subscribe, notifications, all that is there as always. Comments if you want to talk about the Faraway Paladin or any other light novel, I guess. See you later, till next time.